Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast,
Season 38, Episode 10, the Second Battle of Mantinea, Part 2.
This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast.
Xenophon gives us the remarkable detail that in preparation for the battle, the Theban cavalry eagerly whitened their helmets, and the Arcadians painted clubs upon their shields as though they were Thebans, telling us that the Thebans usually had such a blazon on their shields. This is the club of Heracles. All the men sharpened their spears and blades and burnished their shields. The Spartans and Mantineans then arrived and all got ready for the contest, which was to decide the issue, and summoned their allies from every direction, Diodorus tells us. Diodorus lists the Spartan allies, the Eleans, Lacedaemonians, Athenians, and a few others who numbered all told more than 20,000 foot and about 2,000 horse. In contrast, Xenophon claims the union of the Lacedaemonians, the Arcadians, the Achaeans, the Eleans, and the Athenians opposed him. On the side of Epaminondas were the Tegeans, and the most numerous and bravest of the Arcadians were ranged as allies, and also Achaeans from Thessaly, the Boeotians, Argives, some other Peloponnesians, and allies from outside. All in all there were assembled over 30,000 foot and not less than 3,000 horse. Both sides were eager for battle, and the auguries on both sides were favourable. The deployment of the lines were, according to Diodorus, as follows. The Mantineans, with the rest of the Arcadians, occupied the right wing, with the Lacedaemonians as their neighbours and supporters, and next to these were Eleans and Achaeans, and the weaker of the remaining forces occupied the centre, while the Athenians filled the left wing. Opposite them, the Thebans themselves had their post on the left wing, supported by the Arcadians, while they entrusted the right to the Argives. The remaining multitude filled the middle of the line: Euboeans, Locrians, Sicyonians, Messenians, Malians, Aenianians, together with Thessalians and the remaining allies. Both sides divided the cavalry and placed contingents on each wing. This is more detailed than we find in Xenophon. Indeed, Xenophon's account of the battle is overall shorter than in Diodorus. In Xenophon, we are not given any deployment details or the number of troops involved, but that Epaminondas formed his army in line of battle, but then marched them away from Mantinea towards the mountains which lie to the westward and over against Tegea, as if there would be no battle. When they had reached the slope, Epaminondas had the army ground arms so that the enemy relaxed, thinking they were encamping. This is a different sequence of events than that in Diodorus. Xenophon does, however, now give an account of the Theban deployment in echelon, and with one wing, the left, deeper than the other. Unlike in his account of Leuctra, however, he does not give us an actual depth. Xenophon tells us that Epaminondas moved successive companies to the wing where he was stationed and had wheeled them into line, thus strengthening the mass formation of his wing. In Diodorus, battle was expected on both sides, and both armies now sounded the charge, and both raised a shout as they approached the other. In Xenophon, he has already prefaced the battle by stating the Spartans were caught off guard and were not expecting battle. This is highly unlikely, but now Epaminondas gave the order to take up arms and led the advance, and his troops followed. Now as soon as the enemy saw them unexpectedly approaching, no one among them was able to keep quiet, but some began running to their posts, others forming into line, others bridling horses, and others putting on breastplates, while all were like men who were about to suffer rather than to inflict harm. It seems impossible to accept that the enemy was so completely taken by surprise, having pursued the Thebans on their march, but that is the picture Xenophon would have us believe. We can note that Epaminondas had drawn up his men on a slope, just as the Boeotians had at the Battle of Delium in 424 BC. In Diodorus, on the wings, a brief cavalry battle was fought. As the Athenian horse attacked the Theban, they suffered defeat not so much because of the quality of their mounts, nor yet on the score of the riders' courage or experience in horsemanship, for in none of these departments was the Athenian cavalry deficient, but it was in the numbers and equipment of the light armed troops, and in their tactical skill that they were far inferior to their opponents. Indeed, they had only a few javelin throwers, whereas the Thebans had 3 times as many slingers, and javelin throwers sent them from the regions about Thessaly. This passage implies that the light armed troops were indeed deployed with the cavalry, and that the Thebans were superior because of the number of their light armed troops mixed in with their cavalry. Indeed, Diodorus concludes that, consequently, the Athenians, who were continually being wounded by the light armed, and were harried to exhaustion by the opponents who confronted them, all turned and fled. Their flight, however, did not break their own phalanx, something which may have happened at Leuctra, and they rallied, managing to seize some heights overlooking the battlefield, which had been taken by some Euboeans and mercenaries on the Theban side. This cavalry battle, as part of the larger battle of Mantinea and not a separate earlier engagement, seems to make more sense than Xenophon's preliminary clash. It was also a defeat, not a victory, as in Xenophon, which makes more sense given the outcome of the battle. Xenophon does, however, include the Theban cavalry column in his battle account, and it mostly accords with Diodorus's picture. This is despite Xenophon's telling us that the Theban and Thessalian cavalry had already been defeated in the preliminary engagement outside Mantinea itself. Xenophon tells us now that Epaminondas made a strong column of his cavalry also, and had mingled foot soldiers among them, whereas the Athenians and her allies had formed their horsemen like a phalanx of hoplites, 6 deep and without intermingled foot soldiers. Xenophon also states that Epaminondas had stationed both horsemen and hoplites upon some hills over against them, to threaten the Athenians on the left flank and prevent them from going to the aid of the Athenian cavalry, which corroborates the picture in Diodorus. This cavalry action seems to have taken place on the Theban right wing, and the victorious Theban cavalry did not pursue the defeated Athenian and allied cavalry, but then attacked the Athenian phalanx, seeking to outflank it. Diodorus surmises that the battle was a hot one. The Athenians were exhausted and had turned to flee, when the Aleian cavalry commander assigned to the rear came to the aid of the fugitives and, by striking down many Boeotians, reversed the course of the battle. This action sustained the Athenians, but on the other flank too, the cavalry battle had at first been even before the Boeotians and Thessalian cavalry had forced the enemy cavalry back to seek refuge in their own phalanx. Now the infantry closed, and a mighty stupendous struggle ensued. The Boeotians on their own left faced the Spartans close to the enemy right flank. These two forces, we are told, began the conflict, exchanging spear casts and then engaging with swords. Both sides were taking wounds, but would not break off from their contest. Superlative courage was displayed on each side, each man accepting that their death was the price of glory. While the battle raged evenly, Epaminondas decided that the battle called for him to display of his own valour, and that he himself should be the instrument to decide the issue. He therefore immediately took his best men, grouped them in close formation, and charged into the midst of the enemy. He led his battalion in the charge, and was the first to hurl his javelin and hit the commander of the Lacedaemonians. Although he does not name them, nor does Xenophon, these best men seem to refer to the Hieros, Lochos, the 300-strong sacred band. Taking out the commander, which must have been a deliberate ploy, just as targeting Cleombrotus at Leuctra had been, inspired the Boeotians and their allies. Following Epaminondas's attack, the remainder of the men came immediately into the close quarters with the foe. This attack slew some and made others panic, and the enemy phalanx was broken. Diodorus recounts that the Spartans, overawed by the prestige of Epaminondas and by the sheer weight of the contingent he led, withdrew from the battle, but the Boeotians kept pressing the attack and continually slaying any men who were in the rear rank, so that a multitude of corpses was piled up. This is the first detail we get of the possible greater depth of the Theban deployment at Mantinea, even though it was a feature of Leuctra. Diodorus gives no sense of the echelon deployment at the battle, another feature of Leuctra, and which seems to have been one of the purposes of deploying the Thebans on the left of their own line. Even in Xenophon, however, having told us of the deep Theban wing, that detail plays little further part in his account. He tells us, however, that Epaminondas led forward his army prow on like a trireme. He intended, we are told, to cut through the enemy and destroy it entirely. He was preparing to make the contest with the strongest part of his force. But in another reference to the echelon formation, the weakest part he had stationed far back, knowing that if defeated it would cause discouragement to the troops who were with him and give courage to the enemy. In this picture Xenophon attempts to belittle both the plan, formation, and achievement of Epaminondas. The victory was because the Spartans and their allies were unprepared. The Theban formation was not deliberate or intended to dominate the battlefield, as it undoubtedly was, but to shield Epaminondas's weakest troops. The same accusation was made at Leuctra, and his charge intended, we are told, to cut through the enemy and destroy them utterly, something Epaminondas did not achieve. And at the same time, Diodorus's picture is entirely coherent, and it does not attempt to rob Epaminondas of any credit, unlike Xenophon's picture. Xenophon does note that Epaminondas's charge had the desired effect, for by gaining the mastery at the point where he struck, he caused the entire army of his adversaries to flee. Xenophon is quick to jump to the subsequent disappointment, however, stating immediately that, when, however, he had himself fallen, those who were left proved unable to take full advantage thereafter, even of the victory. But although the opposing phalanx had fled before them, their hoplites did not kill a single man or advance beyond the spot where the collision had taken place, and although the cavalry also had fled before them, their cavalry in like manner did not pursue and kill either horsemen or hoplites, but slipped back timorously like beaten men, through the lines of the flying enemy. Furthermore, while the intermingled footmen and the peltasts, who had shared in the victory of the cavalry, did make their way like victors to the region of the enemy's left wing, most of them were there slain by the Athenians. Xenophon's picture is highly unlikely. The victory of the Thebans at Mantinea was not remembered by anyone else as timorous or won by accident. In Diodorus, the Spartans rallied after initially being pushed back by Epaminondas's charge, and themselves charged towards Epaminondas himself. He was pressing forward too eagerly, and amid many missiles and blows was eventually wounded mortally in the chest by a spear strike. He was carried from the field. Despite his loss, the Thebans pressed on and won the victory which Epaminondas had worked so hard to achieve. The Spartans and their allies broke and fled. The Thebans did not pursue them far, however. The Athenian victory against the Euboeans and the mercenaries on the heights led apparently to them claiming the victory, but it was clear to all that the Thebans, who had routed the Spartans and possessed the field, had won a resounding victory. In Xenophon, however, he claims that the confusion over the victory was the result of the preliminary cavalry engagement outside Mantinea. This seems unlikely, given the battle which followed. Eventually, the Spartans sent a herald requesting the bodies of their dead, the traditional sign of admitting defeat. Many sources record Epaminondas's death, even if they do not recount the Battle of Mantinea. Carried alive from the battle back to the Theban camp, he was told that he would die as soon as the spear point was extracted from his chest. Learning that the Thebans had, however, won the battle, he replied, "It's time to die." One of the officers surrounding him lamented that he died without issue. Epaminondas, however, admonished the mourner, "No, by Zeus, on the contrary, I leave behind 2 daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea, my victories." The spear point was then extracted, and Epaminondas died. The history of the 4th century may have been very different had such a man lived. He had reformed and led Thebes to unbelievable victories. There may have been more had he survived Mantinea. Diodorus then summarizes the accomplishments of Epaminondas. He surpassed his contemporaries not only in skill and experience in the art of war, but in reasonableness and magnanimity as well, even comparing him with great men of the age in which he lived, Pelopidas, Timotheus, Cannon, Chabrias, Iphicrates, Agesilaus, and even great men of earlier ages, Solon, Themistocles, Miltiades, Cimon, Myronides, Pericles, Gelon in Sicily. Epaminondas was their superior. If you should compare the qualities of these with the generalship and reputation of Epaminondas, you would find the qualities possessed by Epaminondas far superior, for in each of the others you would discover but one particular superiority as a claim to fame. In him, however, all qualities combined. For in strength of body and eloquence of speech, furthermore in elevation of mind, contempt of lucre, fairness, and most of all in courage and shrewdness in the art of war, he far surpassed them all. Diodorus also adroitly points out that Thebes, which in Epaminondas's lifetime and through him had acquired the primacy of Hellas, now lost it because he was gone. Xenophon is very begrudging in his praise of Epaminondas, really only conceding that he trained his men well. The battle closes his Hellenica, which ends rapidly in 2 brief chapters after the battle, and he finishes with the statement that there was even more confusion and disorder in Greece after the battle than before. Well, thanks once again, Murray, for writing that for us, and that brings us to the end of another season. We got there. Season 38 is now done. Join us soon for the start of season 39.
If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/thehistorynetwork. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Dahm, read by Nick Barker.